Hello friends, I am Dr. Kulkarni and this presentation deals with the appraisal of a research paper published in the literature. The lesson objectives are that at the end of the lesson, the participant should be able to appreciate the need to evaluate a journal article. They should be able to enlist and describe the criteria for evaluating a journal article, and in the end, they should be able to evaluate a journal article based on the criteria given in this presentation. The need for evaluation of a journal article can be seen from the fact that the published articles influence the teaching and the practice of medicine. We teach what we read in the journals. We practice practice medicine with the help of what is published in the literature and in the journals. We say that we practice evidence-based medicine. So the evidence must be examined carefully. If we are practicing an evidence-based medicine, the evidence based on which we practice our practice of medicine should be carefully examined. Many times there is a controversy in two or more articles, and a careful evaluation of the published literature will help in resolving the controversies. So these are the criteria for evaluation of the journal article: the title and the introduction, the material and methods, then the results or the observations, the statistical analysis, the discussion, the references, the ethical issues involved in the subject matter, the bias and its resolution, and overall impact of the article. So let us discuss these one by one. The title of the article is a very important part of the published article in a journal. So we must try to find out whether does the title include the important keywords, because in the days of internet we would be searching the particular article with the help of the keywords, and the keywords should include, or the keywords should be included in the title, so that the searching of the article based on the title itself will be easy. Secondly, does the title indicate the study design? Mention of the study design in the title itself is a very good practice, but if everybody starts following that, then there will be so much uniformity in the titles of the article that the diversity will be lost. But some words, if they are used judiciously in the title, they can indicate the study design. For example, if we say that my article is trying to show an association between a disease and the risk factor, then the person who is reading can draw the inference that probably this is some sort of analytical study, either a case control study or a cohort study or a cross-sectional type of study, cross-sectional type of analytical study. So by merely using the word association, this inference can be drawn by the person who is reading the title. So such words should be introduced in the title so that it is easy for the person reading the title to guess what sort of article he or she is expecting. The study design may be mentioned in the title, especially if it is a clinical trial, because we may search for an article with the keyword as clinical trial in the title. And if our title of the article, if it is a clinical trial, it doesn't include the word clinical trial, may escape the attention of the person who is searching the study and searching the word clinical trial with the word clinical trial in the title. And the last thing is that the title should not be too long or too short. These are the two examples of the titles. The first is the study of two methods of laboratory diagnosis of hepatitis A and hepatitis B in children aged 1 to 15 years in patients admitted in government medical college of a certain place during the period 1st January 2009 to 31st December 2009 with special reference to sensitivity, specificity, predictive power of the positive test and predictive power of the negative test. So such a long title is not desirable for a title of an article in the journal or even for the thesis. This is a title adopted from MD thesis. So it includes almost all the material and methods. So such things should not be there. You are trying to tell the entire story of a suspense movie in the title itself. So then the persons would not be motivated to see the movie because they would say that yes, I know who is the murderer, and the title would tell the person what the movie is like. So the title should not tell the entire story, but it should tell the keywords. That is the important thing to be looked at. And the next is the diabetes and pregnancy. This is too brief a title. Only thing we can infer from this title is that the study is related to diabetes and studies related to pregnancy. But no further idea is obtained from this title. So neither the title should be like the first title, nor it should be like the second title, and there should be judicious combination of the two. So it should not be too long, it should not be too short. So that's about the title of the study. Then the next important component of the published article in the journal is the introduction, which is a very important part of the title. In fact, many persons like me read the introduction first and decide whether the article is worth reading or not. So the title should tell what are you going to expect in this study. So it should give the background of the study in brief. If it is a clinical trial, it should mention without fail with what disease the trial is related to, the drug is related to, and what drug you are going to try and why. So why you have undertaken the trial. The person must get an answer in the introduction as to why this study is being conducted. So we can then decide what to expect in the paper with the help of the title. Therefore, it must indicate why the study was undertaken. It must indicate briefly the knowledge gaps regarding the subject matter of your study. If it is a clinical trial, you must not fail to tell as to what is the current status of the drug treatment with that disease of that disease with the existing line of the treatment, and what are the problems. Maybe that the drugs are more toxic, maybe that the duration of the treatment is long, something like this. So these are the knowledge gaps, and the search for the better drug in the form of less drug reactions, less complications, and less duration is there. Such a search is there, and you must say that with the help of this study, this particular gap may probably be fulfilled. So giving the background of the title and indicating the knowledge gap assures the person who is reading that something worthwhile is coming in front of him after the introduction. There could be few pertinent references. Say the drugs, if you say that there are toxic effects of the drug, you may highlight the studies wherein the toxic effects of the drug have been mentioned. If you are saying that the existing line of the treatment is of long duration, then you must tell as to what is the current duration of the treatment and certain references related to that. Certain journals expect the objectives to be included in the introduction itself. So something like this happens, that with this background and with this knowledge gap, this study was undertaken with such and such objectives, and that after the objectives are told, the introduction is over. Certain people, certain journals expect objectives to be given separately. So objectives may be given in the introduction, it's okay. Objectives could be given separately, it's also okay. It's not as per the wish of the author of the article, but it is according to the policies laid down by the journal. Then material and methods. Material and methods, we expect many things from the material and methods. So there are some parts of the material and methods. So the part one of the material and methods is the research question. And this is an important pillar of the entire research and the entire paper. So it may be given separately or it may be implied in the objectives. So objectives may tell as to what could be the research question, or research question may be given separately. There may be one or two pertinent research questions given, or more than two pertinent research questions are given. But what you should see in the objectives and in the research question as to whether the research question indicate the main variable or variables. So whether only one variable is included, whether two variables are included, and what are those variables. that must be indicated in the objectives. Otherwise, if the objectives are vague and they do not indicate what are the variables included in the research question, then that research question itself is tricky, and then the entire building of the research paper is based then on thin lines. If the variables are measured, you should try to find out whether these variables are measurable or not. Variables may be too vague, so that their measurement itself, because of the vagueness of the variables, may be impossible or very difficult. So the variables mentioned in the research question must be specific and measurable. And whether or not in the objectives and in the research question secondary variables are mentioned or not. As we know, the primary variables are those variables which are mentioned in the research question, and the secondary variables are those variables which are not mentioned in the research question but are part of the study. So it's a good practice, and in fact it is a good thing if the paper gives a list of the primary and secondary variables, and what sort of variables these are, what are the scales of the statistical scale of the measurement of these variables, and what are the summary statistics, and what is the statistical test that will be applied. So if that list is given, it's very nice. But whether at least mention is there about the primary variables and the secondary variables, and that must be there included in the research question itself. The primary variables must be mentioned in the research question, and there should be mention about the secondary variables separately. Hypothesis is again an important component of the material and methods. This is particularly so in case of if the study is analytical or if the study is experimental type. In fact, there cannot be an experimental or analytical study without the hypothesis. So a clear statement of the hypothesis is required. So you must try to find out, is the hypothesis mentioned? So it is required for analytical and experimental studies. And if so, whether it is mentioned, whether it is a one-tail or two-tail hypothesis, or some may refer to it as a one-sided hypothesis or a two-sided hypothesis. So statement of hypothesis and statement whether it is a one-tailed or two-tailed hypothesis is very essential, because many other things depend on this hypothesis. Statement of hypothesis is not an essential criteria for many descriptive types of the study. So one may excuse the authors if the hypothesis is not mentioned in a descriptive study. In fact, in the end, one should find out whether certain hypotheses have been generated out of these studies. So in analytical and in experimental studies, the statement of hypothesis and the statement whether the hypothesis was one-tailed or two-tailed hypothesis must be mentioned. In fact, if there are two research questions, there should be at least two research hypotheses. If there are three research questions, there should be at least three hypotheses in analytical and experimental types of the studies. Then another part in the material and methods is the participants. In fact, there should be the indication of the study population or participants in the research question itself. The research question must indicate the study population, and there should be further elaboration of the study population as a clearly identified population or clearly identified participants. So this is done with the help of inclusion and exclusion criteria. So one must try to find out whether the inclusion criteria mentioned and whether these are clear. There should not be any ambiguity in the inclusion criteria. The same thing about the exclusion criteria. Exclusion criteria should be mentioned and there should not be any ambiguity. There should be a clarity in the mentioned inclusion and exclusion criteria. The next part is the definitions, standard definitions and the units. Many measurements are mentioned in the for the variables. Many variables are there and different methods are used for measuring the quantum of the variables. So one must use the standard definitions for the main variables. If the research question is regarding hemoglobin, one should mention whether hemoglobin will be measured in grams per liter or some other unit is being mentioned, and this should be standard definition. The units of the measurement, the definitions should be the ones which are universally accepted, and the methods of measurement of the variables must be universally acceptable. So use of the standard definitions for the main variables, use of the standard definitions for the secondary variables should be there. There should be standard methods of measurement, especially those measurements which are included in the as the primary variables, and units of measurements like milligrams, international units for all the variables in the research question, and all primary and secondary variables must be mentioned in material and methods. The next part is the sampling method. Many times the study is not conducted on the entire population, entire study population which is defined in the material and methods, but one resorts to the sampling. Then one should try to find out whether does the study mention sampling method for the participants. For a clinical trial, the sampling is not that important, but it is the allocation which is important. So what was the allocation method used for allocating a particular person to the study group and to the control group? In other studies like the descriptive studies and case control studies, one must try to find out how the cases were sampled from the pool of the cases, how controls were sampled from the pool of the controls, and whether the sampling method is truly scientific or not. Many times we find they mention that they were selected randomly. The use of the word random in the text doesn't necessarily mean that the study resorted to a simple random sampling. So the description of how the cases were drawn from the pool of the cases and the controls were drawn from the pool of the controls, and how the participants were recruited even for the descriptive study must be given in details. The scientific name of the methods is a simple random sampling, or a systematic random sampling, or a cluster sampling, or stratified sampling. So these names must be mentioned. Merely random doesn't mean that the authors really have resorted to simple random sampling. And whether is the mentioned sampling method statistically correct. Whatever the method was used, you must try to find out whether it was statistically correct and whether it was truly random or not. Otherwise, the many types of the biases enter in the study. The next part to be seen in the material and methods is the estimation of sample size. As we have said, for the sampling method, as far as if the study is based on the sample, there are two components. One is the sampling method and another is the sample size estimation. So does the study mention the method of calculation of the sample size? Many times the studies mention that 50 participants were selected. But where from this number 50 came in the mind of the investigator or the author, that must be mentioned, and how this figure of 50 was arrived at. So does the study mention the method of calculation of the sample size? Is the formula for calculation of the sample size given, or at least the reference of the formula must be given, from where the formula was taken, that reference must be given. So the formula for calculation of the sample size must be given in the article itself, or the reference must be given. The sample sizes are calculated based on certain assumptions. Statisticians calculate the sample size based on certain assumptions, and these are called as alpha error, beta error, precision, etc. Apart from whether the hypothesis was one-tailed or two-tailed hypothesis. So these things must be mentioned when you mention the method of sample size calculation. So what was the alpha error assumed? What was the beta error assumed? What was the precision assumed? And how many tails the hypothesis had, whether it was a one-tailed hypothesis or two-tailed hypothesis. Then and then only the sample size estimation will be correct, although the sample size formula is given. Unless these things are given, we cannot check whether the sample size calculated was correct or not. If it is given, if these things are given, then we can also calculate the sample size and find out whether the sample size calculated was correct or not. Then there are certain provisions to be made After making the calculations with the help of these presumptions, these are called as the design effect and loss to follow-up. Many studies involve the follow-up, and one must add a provision for the loss to the follow-up. One must also add provision for the design effect. This design effect is itself a subject matter of a separate lecture, but whenever the design effect is mentioned while calculating the sample size, that you must try to find out. Then comes the results or the observations. Some people, in some journal it is mentioned as results, in some paper it is mentioned as observations. The observations are almost always summarized in the form of tables, graphs and figures. So these bring certain amount of precision in the data presentation. So tables, graphs and figures are used. Apart from looking whether these are numbered correctly or not, one must try to find out whether the profile of the participants is given in table number 1. All journals expect the profile of the participants to be given in the first table. So if it is a clinical trial, the profile of the participants in the study group and the control group must be given in one table. So what was the gender distribution? What was the age distribution? What was the distribution of the severity of the disease in the two groups? So these things must be given in the profile of the participants in the first table. Then the tables include the totals. These are called marginal totals and the column totals. Marginal totals and the column totals. And the totals must tally in all tables. Like for example, if the total of the males and females is 100 and if the total in the age distribution is 98, that means in at least 2 persons the age was not recorded correctly. It was not recorded at all, and the author has got the information about the 98 individuals only. So in 2 individuals the information about the age is not available. So that inference we can draw. So the totals must tally wherever required. Then footnotes must be given wherever the totals are not tally or wherever they are required. Many times the totals may not tally, not because of the mistake by the authors, but because of some reasons. So that must be explained in the form of footnotes. In the charts of the graphs, the scales must start from 0. Otherwise, an erroneous conclusion is likely to be drawn, especially if it is a time trend. If the graphs are not starting from the 0, one may infer that there is a rapid decline or increase in the variable. So one must see whether the scales are starting from 0 or not. So these are the precautions as far as the tables and the graphs are concerned. Then one must see whether there was a deviation from protocol. One may ask as to how we will know whether there is a deviation from the protocol when we do not have the protocol itself. One thing is that the many journals make it compulsory for the authors to see that their protocol is available in the public domain. So therefrom you can get the protocol, especially in the clinical trials. That provision is there nowadays. But even if it is not there, one can find out whether there was a deviation from the protocol with a certain signs that may be seen. For example, we may find failure to record all variables for all subjects. Many variables are there, and for all participants, all variable records should be there. If there are missing data for certain variables, then we may infer that there was a deviation from the protocol. Failure to recruit required number of participants. The authors may give a detailed description how the sample size was calculated, and in the end, if we find that the desired sample size was not achieved at all, such things may be seen by us. So failure to recruit the required number of participants as it was given in the material and methods, that you may find sometimes, many times rather. Failure to follow all the subjects. Initially in the clinical trial, there were 100 groups, 100 individuals in each group, so 200 individuals, and one may find that at the end of the follow-up, only 80% were followed, or 90% were followed. So there is a failure to follow up all the subjects. So that may occur. There may be unequal follow-up in the groups. The study group may have a follow-up rate of 95%, and in the control group there is only 80%. So that indicates a follow-up bias or a differential follow-up in the cases and the controls. There may be violation of inclusion criteria. The persons may say that in the material and methods, they may say that we have included the individuals only in 15 to 45 years of age. But when you find out, you see that there is an individual is 13 years in the study population. So there is a violation of the inclusion criteria, because in the material methods you say it is 15 to 45 years is the inclusion criteria. Then how does a individual aged 13 years is there in your observation? So that failure, a violation of the exclusion criteria may be there. Violation of the measurement or ascertainment criteria may be there. In the material methods, they may say that the certain variable is recorded and is recorded in grams per deciliter, and in the material, in the observations, you see that this variable is measured in millimoles per liter or per deciliter, something like this. So that is a violation in the measurement and ascertainment criteria tools is there. So this sort of things requires a certain basic knowledge of the research methodology. Then comes the statistical analysis. In the results column also there may be statistical analysis given. So there are two aspects of the statistics. One is the descriptive statistics and another is the inferential statistics. In the descriptive statistics, we may try to find out for quantitative data whether the descriptive stats like the number, minimum number, the total number of the individuals in that group, the minimum observation for that variable, the maximum observation for that variable, and the mean and the standard deviation are given or not. So for any quantitative variable, the number of the individuals, the maximum number, the minimum number, the mean and the standard deviation must be given. Few people have got the habit of giving only the mean and the standard deviation. They do not give the minimum and the maximum values. So we do not know what was the range of the observations. They do not give the number of the observations based on which the mean and the standard deviation are based. So it's a good practice to mention the number, the minimum value, the maximum value, the mean and the standard deviation for all quantitative variables. Are the sample estimates like mean, proportion, odds ratio, relative risk, cure rates are accompanied by 95% confidence intervals? Whenever the description of a variable is in the form of sample and the sample estimates are there, these are also called as point estimates. So if these point estimates are given, one must try to find out whether the 95% confidence intervals of these are given. If these are not given, that means certain things are not given incomplete to you, and certain things are withheld by the authors. That inference you may draw. Then the next thing is the inferential statistics. So one must try to find out whether is the significance of the observed difference, association or correlation is tested with appropriate statistical test. The correlation value of the two quantitative variables may be mentioned, but its 95% confidential intervals are not given, and the statistical significance of it in the appropriate statistical test is not given. The authors claim that there is an association between a risk factor and the outcome factor in the form of an odds ratio, but the significance of that odds ratio in the form of significance test is not given. So that must be given, and you must try to find out whether it is with the appropriate statistical test. And if the statistical test is applied, then whether the probabilities values, actual probability values are mentioned. People have got a tendency of showing it as less than 0.05 or more than 0.05. That's not a good practice. So the actual probability value found in that particular example must be given, not whether it is less than 0.05 or more than 0.05. That sort of thing must not be there. For not significant result, it's a good practice to show the result of power analysis. Because if the results are not significant, it could be because of two things, that the sample size may be inadequate or the results are not significant. So the power analysis, especially when the results are not significant, becomes a very important thing for that particular variable. So that must be seen in the inferential statistics. Then in the discussion, one must try to find out whether the discussion was appropriate or not. Well, how do we say whether it was appropriate or not? So is the discussion concentrated around the answers to the research question first? So what was the research question? One may refer back. And the discussion will start on the observations and discussion on the research question first, because that deals with the primary variables. So the discussion should start first on the primary variables, and the primary variables are those which are on the research question. So the discussion should be concentrated around the variables in the research question first. If the author is dealing with the variables not in the research question first, we may infer that nothing of importance has been found by that author as related to the variables in the research question. And that's why he is dealing with the research questions that were not in the variables not in the research question. So the discussion should be concentrated around the answers to the research question first. What was the answer received by the statistical analysis of the observations? That must be mentioned first in the discussion, and then a person may proceed to the secondary variables. Is the small statistical difference given undue importance? Many times the people concentrate on the statistical significance and not on the clinical significance. So whether the small statistical significance is given an undue importance, like for example, the cure rate of the new drug was say 96%, and the cure rate of the established line was 95%. So 1% difference was found statistically significant. So this is a small difference in the cure rates, and this has been given a huge importance in the form of recommending that drug. So 1% drug is 1% increase in the cure rate may not be clinically significant for the clinicians, considering other aspects of the drug. So whether the statistical significance is discussed with the clinical significance or not, that must be found out. Sometimes a large difference is ignored at saying minor. For example, the person may observe that the difference in the males and the female distribution in the study group and control group was there, and probably that may have led to the difference in the cure rate. But the author tries to say that there was a minor difference in the proportion of the males and the females in the study group and control group, and he says that is a minor difference, and that has not led to the difference in the cure rate. If this is the sort of affairs in the discussion, then this is not a good practice. So whether a large difference or the significant difference is ignored as saying minor, especially the secondary variables. Are the incidental findings that are not included in the research question given undue importance? Sometimes the main study variable is the cure rate of the drug. That was the main study variable, and the side effects was the secondary variable. But suddenly the person finds that there is no difference in the cure rate of the two drugs, and there is a difference in the side effects of the drug. The new drug is given less side effects. That is what is the conclusion. Then the authors try to say that this is a good drug because it is giving less cure rate, less side effects. So that is the argument in the discussion. But was the cure rate, what was the main objective? What was the primary objective? Primary objective was the cure rate, and the side effects was the secondary objective. The study was not planned for the detecting the difference between the difference in the side effects of the two drugs. That was the secondary objective, and the sample size, etc., was not done for finding out the difference in the side effects of the two drugs. So, are the incident, and therefore, any observations on the secondary variables is an incidental finding, and giving it too much importance in the discussion is not desirable. And one must also try to find out whether the secondary variables are analyzed or not. If the primary variables are only analyzed and secondary variables are not analyzed, that means there are certain problems in the conclusion drawn by the author. Then in the discussion, there must be some mention on the possibility of the bias. Has analysis for possible bias, like in the stratified analysis, multivariate analysis, was it attempted or not? Some types of the biases can be answered by stratified analysis and multivariate analysis. But if it is not done at all, that means some biases were not addressed to in the study. The common biases are the selection bias, the classification bias, the follow-up bias, the recall bias, and the confounding bias. And a possibility of the bias is always there in any given types of the studies. And whether the author has mentioned the bias and what precaution he or she has taken in order to address the possibility of the bias must be there in the discussion. The author should also mention the limitations and the strengths of the article in the discussion itself. So, are the limitations of the study mentioned and discussed in the study? Discussion doesn't mean that the discussion should be in the paragraphs. Some mention must be there that these are the limitations of the study and so on. Are the limitations of the study mentioned and discussed in the article, in the discussion section? Are the strengths of the study mentioned and discussed? So, mention of the limitations and the strengths of the study must be there in the article itself. People discuss about the strengths, but they mostly do not discuss about the limitations of the study. Is it mentioned as to what knowledge gap is filled by the study? Initially, the authors claim that this study, in the introduction, the authors may claim that this study intends to fill in the knowledge gap. So, whether that objective was filled in, so a mention must be there in the discussion as to this knowledge gap has been fulfilled, which was the primary objective of the study mentioned in the introduction itself. So, is it mentioned as to what knowledge gap is filled by the study? That must be there in the discussion. We may find certain recommendations in the discussion itself, or recommendations may be given separately by certain people. So, are the recommendations done? Are the recommendations feasible? Many times unfeasible recommendations are made in the study. Are the recommendations based on the observations or are they author's opinion? The recommendations must be based on the observations in the study. They must not be, the origin of the recommendations must not be through the opinion of the authors. The opinion of authors must be based on the observations, and the observations must be based on the sound clinical study. Sound epidemiological study. So these things must be seen in the recommendations, whether the recommendations are done, are the recommendations feasible, and are the recommendations based on the observations, or they are just based on the author's opinion. And there are certain ethical issues in the study. So one can find out whether certain things are there or not in the study. Is the permission from ethics committee taken and mentioned? Usually this is mentioned in the either in the material and methods, or this may be mentioned in the acknowledgement section. So you must try to find out whether the mention is there. Sometimes the study is observational, so people feel like not mentioning the permission of the ethics committee. They do not take also the permission of the ethics committee. So that's not a proper thing. Even the observational studies need the permission from the ethics committee. So is the permission from the ethics committee taken and mentioned in the article itself? In case of experimental study, is the possible conflict of the interest mentioned? This is particularly so in the experimental study. That doesn't mean that it is not required for other studies. So mention of the conflict of interest must be mentioned. It is a clinical trial of a drug manufactured by a company, and the authors are office bearers of that pharmaceutical company. There is nothing wrong if a person from the pharmaceutical industry takes part in writing the article, but that fact must be mentioned in the article that the author number so and so is also the holding such and such post in the trial of the drug. People take the financial help from certain organizations, so that must be mentioned that this article was financially supported by such and such institute. That must be mentioned without any reservations. That must be mentioned. So that part is taken care of regarding the conflict of interest. So we tell what are the finances of the study. In case of clinical trial, another important thing is that is the trial registered in the clinical trial registry of the country, and that number, unique ID, must be mentioned. The clinical trial registry of the country gives a unique ID for the clinical trials, and that ID must be mentioned so that we can find out certain details of the clinical trial at the trial registry itself. So we need not contact then the authors for certain minor details which are not clarified in the original article. So the trial registry number and the permission must be mentioned in the ethical issues. Then whether or not the authors have resorted to standard reporting methods. Each type of the article, there are certain internationally accepted guidelines for the different study designs. For example, for descriptive studies, there are stroke guidelines. For analytical studies, also there are stroke guidelines for the analytical studies. For clinical trials, there are consort guidelines. For diagnostic tests, there are STAR D guidelines. So whether the good authors mention these things in the article itself, that this article has been prepared as per the guidelines of the stroke or as per the guidelines of the consort. So this must be mentioned. Even if it is not mentioned, one can find out whether it is as per the guidelines. If we have studied the stroke guidelines for the descriptive studies, the stroke guidelines for the analytical studies, and so on and so forth. So the mention of that, if it is not there, we may presume that the article is not as per the guidelines of these internationally accepted organizations. The references are there at the end of the article, and one must find out whether the references are appropriate for the study. There should be restriction that too wide net of the research references should be avoided. That the article is on the clinical trial of the drug for a disease, and the people start their article with the sentences something like that: this disease was known in Ayurveda, it is known with such and such name in Ayurveda, such and such drug is used in was used in Ayurveda, such and such drug is used in Unani, and so on and so forth. That is not required. One must restrict ourselves to the references. People have a tendency of showing that they have referred to such a large number of references. So one must try to find out whether the references were appropriate for the study. If it is a clinical trial, then one must try restrict ourselves to the clinical trial of the disease. It is not necessary to give the references of the old ages and what the disease was called at in Ayurveda and Unani and homeopathy, something like this. It is not expected. So are the references used correctly in the discussion? Many times the references are there. One may try this exercise in certain articles. You may try to find out whether a certain reference is actually referred to in the text of the references or not. In few articles I have found this way, that reference number 10 or 11 was not at all referred to in the entire article. So 10 and 11 were only taken to enlarge the references list. So such tactics are adopted by the authors, and these are not good practices. So are the references used correctly in the discussion, and are the references are in the uniform pattern? So there are different patterns like Vancouver or Harvard. So if Vancouver system is adopted, then the citations in the text and the ultimate list of the references should be as per Vancouver style. If the citations are as per Harvard standard, the citations and the ultimate list of the references must be as per Harvard standards. So these things one can see. Last, if you summarize all these things, one may judge about the overall impact of an article. For example, if it is a clinical trial, one may ask the question to himself or herself whether you would recommend this drug to your patients based on the evidence in this article. So you have seen the evidence of a clinical trial, and tomorrow one must be able to answer this question based on the article, whether you would recommend this drug to your patients based on the evidence in the article. If your answer is yes, then the article is good. If your answer is no, then there are certain lacunae in the drug, lacunae in the article. Regarding the article, we may say regarding other trials, would you refer this article on the basis of the evidence? Suppose you are taking a lecture on a certain disease, and you are referring to the risk factors of the disease. So would you refer this article for the risk factors of the disease? This article has shown that a certain risk factor is there for a certain disease, and based on the evidence given in this article, whether you would say in your lecture that such and such a disease has got such and such risk factor based on this article, you say. So if that is so, then this article is of a good quality. If the answer to this is no, then the article is not of a good quality. And this is an exercise which you may undertake for any article which you are reading or which you have come across or which you are presenting in your department in the journal reporting or journal club, whatever name you call to that activity. So these are the various heads under which we have discussed this article. So title and introduction, and the subheads in this PowerPoint presentation are 1.1 and 1.2. So title and introduction, 10 marks. Material and methods, 10 marks, and so on and so forth. So the total marks are 100. And then you and your friends evaluate this article separately and give the marks separately. It is like taking an examination taking an examination of a student by two examiners. So let him analyze the article separately, and you analyze the article separately, and try to find out whether you reach a similar conclusion. Give these marks according to this list. The total marks are 100. And if your conclusion is that the total marks are equal to or more than 80, then the article is of excellent quality. That rating for the article is excellent. If it is between 60 to 79, we may say that it is a good article. If it is between 50 to 59, we may say that it is an average. And if it is less than 50, it is below average. Of course, this division is arbitrary and you may have your own criteria, but these are, we feel that this is a fairly reasonable type of rating scale given, and you may try this in your journal club or when you read a particular article. This is the further reading on this topic in the basics of research methodology. This book has been published by Paras Medical booksellers, and the website on which you can have this book is this website, and from here you can purchase the book online. The Basics of Biostatistics is the book published by CBS publishers, and it is available on this particular website. It is available on the Flipkart also. So, ladies and gentlemen, with this I thank you very much, and I hope that this presentation has satisfied your queries regarding the publication, regarding the article. If you have got any queries, you can contact me on this email ID, drapkulkarni@gmail.com. Thank you very much.